And so, looking at the sector, we know that how important it is. I think everybody here in the audience understands the importance of our sector. But it's maybe sometimes for people outside the sector hard to understand the impact and how it really works. And the real question I have, for you guys who are deeply entrenched in this, what is the best kept secret? What is it that the people crowd over here should know that would blow their minds? And maybe Peter, I'm going to put you on the spot here on this tough question. So let me know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think it's probably what I've found to be the most interesting over the last 4 years is kind of how far behind a lot of the current sort of financial infrastructure is today. So, whether it's you're talking to, a major like commercial bank and you find out they're running on like 7,000 different systems to the extent that they're not quite sure how many systems they have, or that when they deploy new software, they have to go, into a server that only like 3 people left in the world know how to program because it's, written in some obscure, totally outdated language. So I always kind of knew that some of the infrastructure was behind or bad, but I thought it was maybe 1 or 2 generations behind. I wouldn't have really guessed it was like 5 or 6.
Right.
And so the level of legacy and the amount of technical debt that a lot of financial institutions have to dig out of is pretty huge, which means it's a great opportunity for a lot of startups.
Yeah, and I guess, ultimately it's payments, right? So people are very careful. And I don't know, Jakob, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I actually think this industry holds a world record that is fairly unknown to people. And this world record is, the industry holds the world record in creating solutions looking for problems.
Right.
It's a lot of crappy solutions that have been made up by this industry. I think QR codes is a fantastic example. There are tons of other things, but I mean, that world record is probably unknown.
Kevin, do you agree with that?
No, I would agree. I certainly, especially when it comes to QR codes, I really never got the point. No, I mean, I think we've been in that place. I mean, Worldpay started life as an independent company only 4 years ago. Before that, we were part of a bank. I mean, we've spent more than £1 billion getting ourselves out of that technology of the 1970s and building a next generation platform. But I actually think the thing that most people don't realize, especially from where we're sitting, is actually just how complex, complicated, and fragmented the world that we live in still is. And I always think the statistic that best draws that out is, living in the UK or Western Europe, certainly in the US, you're used to the fact that Visa, MasterCard, and American Express are the way that people pay, and you assume that's the way everybody pays for everything. And the reality is actually, in many parts of the world, that's not how people were ever used to pay, and what our industry badly calls alternative payment methods is actually the norm elsewhere. And with new innovation coming and new payment types emerging, new currencies emerging, and entirely new systems, actually it's becoming more complicated, not less at the moment. And I think a lot of people don't appreciate quite how fragmented it still is.
I think that's a good point. I'll get back to that one too. I just wonder, Jürgen, if there's any other points there you'd like to sort of add.
For me, I think the real-time aspects of things is something I think is quite interesting. I mean, we live in a world where people want a kind of instant gratification or instant satisfaction. And I think that is something that banks have not yet realized. And so, although I'm sending you money and it might take a day and you don't necessarily need the money, because of the fact that you're used to having things here and now, you want to see it immediately. And so banks have to change their, that immediate factor will have a big impact on the bank. So that's one end, the real-time aspects. I think PSD2, I mean, that's a regulation from the European Commission that will enforce banks to open their back-office systems. I think that will also generate a whole new industry, because banks before could say, well, it's my data and I'm keeping it with myself. But now governments will actually force banks to open that. And so banks today are still struggling. I mean, they don't even know how to deal with their existing structures, let alone that they will have to open it for third parties. And so I think, well, I'm pretty positive from that perspective. There's a whole new wave of new technology coming, and also companies that will help, in a way, banks, but also a lot of opportunity for technology companies.
Great. I mean, so Kevin, back to your question. So looking at the speed of change, the problems of how we're going to get this change to go as quickly as we can, because again, there's a sort of assumption, right, that we have to be globally win everywhere, right? And there has to be sort of a uniform standard. There's a little bit of that philosophy, at least in software in general. And if, as you say, they're very specific, sometimes regional, sometimes sectors that have their own systems and thoughts. We know that in Germany, for example, credit cards is not really the way forward for them. And actually, we're noticing in Africa, mobile payments is just booming. That's been booming for a while, and they've been fairly innovative. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that and how you deal with these discrepancies? And at the same time, we need that pace of change,
Well, I mean, I think in some ways that sort of the question answers itself. I mean, I don't think we're going to have any luck trying to force a universal standard, on a global economy that has consumers that have different preferences, different structures and systems around them that drive different sets of behavior. So I think we have to be aware of it and adapt to it rather than try and change it.
So, Jakob, yours, obviously, you're dealing with the nuts and bolts of this sort of every day, dealing with the SMEs. Do we just tear our hair out and sort of deal with these complexities, or do you think that there's ways of layering this thing that just can maybe make the transition smoother?
I think, technology can always layer things. I mean, that's the basics. But then tailor-making sort of the offering and making sure that you're relevant in each and every market, it's a tougher level of complexity. And I also think that's one of the reasons why you see sort of US companies exploding both in terms of valuations and sort of growth, because they are in a very different market compared to where we are in Europe. Every market is unique. You can never sort of expect any of the markets to behave in the same type of way. Even though Norway and Sweden and Finland are sort of close by, consumer behavior is radically different between the countries. So it's really sort of building things from scratch, building virality from scratch, building the consumer experience from scratch, and the messaging. So it's hard work.
Peter, though, you come from a different world, right, where actually software, you're sort of penetrating these markets, right, with the Bitcoin blockchain area. We're sort of seeing that as in a sense, one of the areas that can solve a lot of these problems, or people believe can solve a lot of these problems.
Yeah, so I think there's two things there, and it's important to remember that there actually is a dominant system of payments in the world today, by a huge margin too, and it's cash, right? So, despite the fact that we make most of our payments with swipe cards or whatever else, if you look at the total number of payments on a daily basis, most of them are actually done in cash by a pretty strong majority. For us, though, it's a little different. You're talking about this sort of standard. The underlying platform is definitely a standard and definitely the same in every market for us. But we actually, our software is different in a lot of markets because people conceptualize money very differently, right? So someone in Russia thinks about their money being in and the best English translation is maybe purse, right? Someone in China conceptualizes how they hold their money differently. In the States, the closer you get it to looking like a credit card or a mobile banking app, the better off you are. And so, I mean, nothing is more sort of indicative of this than in Apple Pay, where after a lot of research, they frustratingly figured out that the best way to store and display cards inside of a phone was to literally take a digital and put which is weird, right? It's really kind of weird when you think about it, right? But that's how consumers conceptualize where they keep their money, how they transact. And so for us, while that underlying platform is always consistent and the same, the platform on top of that, or the user experience, can vary quite dramatically by market.
So, but Jürgen, this is really you spent part of your life work doing, right? Trying to make it, simplify it. So.
Yeah. But what I see is that today, a lot of the tier 1 banks all realize they have a problem. And so they're all setting up programs to become digitalized, and they're all making their own little middleware in a way, which is a kind of strange, because if you have all these banks doing the same thing, they don't have enough people to do it. They don't have the budgets really to do it. So it would make, in my opinion, much more sense for them to work on this kind of standardized middleware almost together and have banks from different countries work together to build this middleware so that they have it, and then they can compete on the front end with each other and potentially also with some of the technology companies, because today they use their budget for their own because they want to own the technology and they want to own everything. But in my opinion, the fight between banks is going to be on the front end. It's not going to be on the back end. You need to have a very good back end, but it's probably much better to have that built by a technology company rather than banks spending all of their money in IT, through IT, and I think a bank should be a bank. A bank should not be an IT company.
Interesting. Yeah. So that.
I don't know. I think so. For me, I think that would be the right strategy. That would be the optimal strategy. But what you see happening is actually the opposite. So, for example, Chase Pay, right, which launched in the U.S. a couple of weeks ago. A huge initiative by one of the largest consumer banks in the U.S. building an Apple Pay competitor. And the funny thing there is that if they intended to ever have partners, they probably wouldn't have named it after themselves, right? Chase Pay, to have partners, right? So what you actually see is them fragmenting even harder. And I think this comes down to the culture of a bank, which the culture of a bank is not, let's go out into the market, find the best tool. Maybe it's an open source tool. Maybe it's a tool that we buy from a vendor that 6 other banks buy. It's how do we lock that down? And it's really relevant for you as an entrepreneur, because if you come into the fintech space and you're building back office software, you're constantly, and this is something we experience, going to get banks that want to sign exclusive deals with you, that want to buy you, that want to strategically invest in you. But above all, if they're going to work with you, they don't want you to be able to work with anybody else, because they view these platforms and these back ends as some kind of competitive advantage, and they're not. And they just haven't figured this out yet.
Yeah, well, that's why they need to change it. I agree.
So maybe that's really the question then. What do we see the role of banks, right? And you guys have sort of given your view on that. I'd love to hear the rest of you guys. How should banks be the center of innovation? Should you guys, the fintechs, be the guys who do it? Do we need them engaged? Do we need them involved? How do you work with these partners yet fierce competitors who you guys are threatening their livelihoods at the same time? Maybe Jakob, let me get your view on that.
Well, like I said during my presentation, I think banks are a fundamental sort of part of the infrastructure of society going forward as well. They need to undergo a pretty dramatic and painful sort of internal change from the bottom all the way up. But right now, I don't think they have much of a choice rather than to work alongside and cooperate with companies like ours. Otherwise, I think they risk standing sort of on the sideline of what's inevitably going to happen, and that's going to be more detrimental for them going forward. So there is no real choice. There are still some sort of late bloomers, let's call them that, in the banking industry. They're still struggling and still believe that they can do everything themselves. But I'd say that the mindset has changed quite dramatically over the last couple of years. They realize that they can't keep up and they need to cooperate to innovate.
And you got a really interesting, given Worldpay where it came from.
Yeah, I mean, given our history, certainly.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're all right. It's undoubtedly the case that, with the payment arms or payment operations of banks being hived off over the last few years, that's one of the things that's clearly driven innovation and renewal in payments. But fundamentally, banks are part of the infrastructure, and they'll be part of the solution as much as they've been part of the problem. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about Apple Pay, Android Pay, Samsung Pay, is that while they seem new to consumers, actually, in the back end of those, they run on the same old payment rails that are Visa and MasterCard. So in some ways, there's innovation there, but actually the banks are part of that ecosystem as well.
Yeah.
What is interesting, though, I think, is this issue of the fragmentation that's driving for consumers. So the payment world has always been complicated for us. It's increasingly complicated for merchants. It's actually becoming a bit complicated for consumers as well, mostly because of this plethora of choice that they've now got. So really, how many payment apps or ways to pay on my phone could I possibly want?
Yeah. I love it, Kevin. Every time you dovetail into my next question. So basically, let's go to the consumer, right? Let's look at that side of things. Because we're here excited about change and we want people to change, but actually consumers are very slow to change. Paying online is still something people are hesitant about, and we're getting all excited about Bitcoin, and actually people are just dealing with online payments. And it's really interesting that if you look at the statistics, 50% of the people who have bank accounts have had them for more than 10 years, right? So it's not like people are running around making big changes. So it would just get your view, like how do we get consumers acting quicker and get that pace of change on that side of things? Jürgen?
For me, it's a factor of convenience. I think if you have convenient solutions like kind of apps, like almost an app store, where your bank actually provides all kind of apps that would make my life easier, then I would probably use it. So I think the banks will have to figure out ways on the front end side to make these cool apps that if I use it, it's going to make my life easier. And then there's tons of examples. If I'm a baker and I need to bake my bread, I don't want to deal with all of the accounting stuff, so maybe the bank can provide a scanner. I scan my invoices, they go up real time into a database, and real time I get my P&L and balance sheet stuff, and then the bank gets view on how I'm doing. And I mean, there's a whole heap of applications that could work in a way that it makes life of consumers convenient. So for me, it's about convenience.
Peter, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of times, when we're talking about consumers and banking and financial apps, we're thinking of like ourselves.
Yeah.
And so we think, I've got like 6 credit cards, Samsung Pay, Android Pay, and Apple Pay. It's like, why do I need another one? I think that the key there is that there's a lot of parts of the world where they don't have any digital payment methods. And in some cases, we find those areas to be a lot easier to see growth in than, convincing, for example, a British person to use Bitcoin is actually quite challenging because they have faster payments, they have credit cards, they've got TransferWise, God knows what else. Convincing someone, in Chile or someone in Indonesia to use Bitcoin is about a 30-second, 45-second process. Whereas, in the UK, it might be 3 or 4 days. And so I think that, a lot of times it depends what your target audience is, and it comes back to that convenience principle. And I think that making it more convenient for the consumer in the UK, in the Nordic zone, and in the US to an extent is extremely challenging. But I think that there is parts of the world where making it more convenient is not extremely challenging. And I think perhaps sometimes it's best to focus on those areas.
Jakob, finally.
Coming back to my previous statement on the world record, I think the reason why consumer behavior has taken so long to kind of change in this industry is because there's been so many crappy solutions presented over the years, so who the hell would want them?
Yeah.
I think that's a good starting point. So consumer behavioral shifts goes in steps, and I think what we're seeing now with Apple Pay and the likes is just the logical next step of what the contactless card that was introduced a couple of years ago, that kind of convenience level just transferred into a device that we carry with us on a daily basis. It makes sense. It's a logical consumer behavioral shift. So I think that will ultimately kind of speed up things. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting, if we could create brands. I know that, really banks are all about a brand, right? At the end of the day, that's all they are. But it would be interesting to see if we could create the same love of the brands, if you see what I mean, instead of just the brand. I don't know, Kevin, what's your thoughts?
Well, that's actually, if I go back to kind of, my presentation earlier, for us, there's an interesting question about, do we ever need to be or want to be a consumer-facing brand? Would we ever want a Worldpay wallet or Worldpay Pay? Ooh, that's awkward. Probably not, actually. And we see a world in which actually we and the entire payment ecosystem could be almost or completely invisible to the consumer, and you won't need a brand at all. But that does raise interesting questions of trust. So.
Yeah.
I think there's actually one more thing, and that is ubiquity. Today there's so much noise, so many apps in our phones that we never use. And I think unless you have something that works everywhere, the solution is obsolete at the point of arrival, more or less. I mean, if I can't pay with my card or whatever type of technology I use in the countries or next door, then it's kind of useless. I don't want one app for every market.
But I think that's also the advantage that banks today still have. They're still very much local. And banking is still, wherever you like it or not, it's still a very much localized thing. And so I think that together with the compliance factor is still something that banks have, and that they should, in my opinion, use much more the fact that they're local, that they have offices all over the place in a way.
So we need ubiquity, simplicity, but there's big contradictions there as well, basically, in terms of how we deal with it. So, my final question, we're running out of time here. And, I was looking at, should we or are we looking forward to a cashless world? Is this what the ultimate is? When you're saying cash is still the most important, but what is this what we're fighting for? Is this the dream? And I just would love your thoughts on that. Jürgen, maybe you start.
Yeah, I mean, that would be cool, but not just cashless, but fully integrated. I mean, where you have an invoice, it's automatically paid, it hits into the ERP, it gives all the taxation forms, all of that completely automated. So not just the payment side, but the whole end-to-end cycle, basically.
Cool, like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're the CEO of a company, the dream is shareholder value, right?
Yeah.
So there's that. But that aside, I think that the dream is not just can we abstract payments, can we make them invisible? But I think it's can we make them in a sense ubiquitous? Can we do payments in such a way that I can interact with anybody? And I think that's what counts.
So contrary to what I do, I would actually hate a cashless society. There are things that I don't want you guys to know that I buy. For example, so privacy for me is pretty important, and you can ask me later what it is that I buy. But I think privacy is a major issue.
Yeah.
So I would hate the cashless society. Let's keep cash.
Great, Kevin.
I agree. I mean, I think people have predicted the end of cash for a long time, and actually, it seems like it's a very long way off to me. I mean, we just did a piece of research which we're about to release, where we've been looking at what's happening with different payment types around the world, and actually, what's really interesting is that cash, in particular, cash on delivery. For e-commerce is actually on the rise in some parts of the world where people have issues with security and in particular counterfeit goods. So I don't think anybody really expects cash to disappear completely anytime soon.
All right, well let's give a round of applause for the panel, and we want ubiquity, simplicity, and more cash. Thanks a lot. All right, thank you. Bye. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Bye.
Yeah.